From the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis, this is Indiana Issues. Here's your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz.
Hello and welcome to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Well, lots of things to talk about on the program today. Property tax assessments, gas taxes, mass shootings, you name it. So we've got lots of issues to get through, and our panel is with us today as well. Our good friends Mike Murphy, Republican, Democrat Laura Beck, and Brad Klopfenstein of the Greater Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. Hoosiers are feeling the effects, my friends, of very high gas prices these days, as well as property tax assessments. And so there's talk about whether the government should provide relief in both areas. So, Mike, let's go ahead and start with you. What can the legislature seriously do about high gas prices? Also, you as a former lawmaker yourself.
Well, I think it's tempting to jump to that, conclusion that somehow we should lower gas taxes. Frank O'Bannon did it when gas was only $1.80 a gallon way back in the day, and it scored some political points for him and maybe provided some temporary relief. But the fact is, if you lower the gas taxes, you're not just lowering them for Hoosier taxpayers, you're lowering them for every trucker who drives across the state of Indiana, every tourist who happens to jump in for the race. And if your goal is to provide tax relief, nationwide, so to speak, then go ahead and do that. But I think the governor is being very smart and being very judicious by coming up with a plan, which he's not released yet, which will provide some inflationary / gas relief, because it's all really lumped into one when you're trying to feed your family, and in the near future. And we'll just have to see what he comes up with. I think he is smart not to jump at the easy political bait.
Laura, Democrats have said the governor should double the income tax, the tax refund from $125 to $250 to give folks a little bit of relief. Your thoughts on that proposal?
Well, I think, one of the things I think we have to be really mindful right now is we're feeling the effects of the global economy, frankly. You've got the gas issue, you've got inflation, you have all of these different elements. And I think with where the Democrats are headed on this is we do have a surplus. We do have the ability to lighten the load for people right now when times are tough. And so I think a lot of times will hear Republicans complaining about the high gas taxes, but then not planning on doing anything about it because for whatever possible reason they have. So I really think that if we want to lighten the load for Hoosiers, if we want to help working families, if we want to help all families, then these are some options and some opportunities that we can do. And it just makes sense at this point in time. I mean, Mike's right. Yes, it is politically popular, but frankly, we're in unprecedented times coming out of this pandemic. And if we can make life easier for Hoosiers right now, especially because of the global economic factors that are affecting people, then by all means, let's do it.
Brad, let me ask you, should lawmakers suspend the gas tax or maybe get rid of it altogether?
Well, let's suspend it until we can get rid of it. We'll start with that one. How about that? As Mike mentioned, when Frank O'Bannon did it, we had a paltry $1 billion surplus. That has now ballooned to, I believe, $7 billion. I think instead of talking about refunds, the easiest thing to do, suspend the gas tax, suspend the sales tax on gas. And as was mentioned, we're the crossroads of America. We've got travelers coming in from all over the place. Make this a destination to fill up. I have a feeling we'd end up collecting more tax revenue, and just with all the tourists and truckers that are coming through. I think we've got to do it. The other thing I think we've got to do, Southern Indiana has oil wells. Let's do everything we can to encourage them to open up those taps and start producing as much as they can.
Well, in addition to the gas tax, there's also property tax assessments. A lot of folks seeing that property taxes assessments go up like anywhere from 10 to 15, in some cases even 50%. Mike, I'll start with you on this one. Did we just cap property taxes a while back? And if we're going to provide Hoosiers with property tax relief, should it be done on the front end or the back end?
Well, first of all, yes, when we did it, I think it was roughly 2007, and then we put it into the Constitution in 2010, which is the 1%, 2%, and 3%, residential, farm, and business. Generally, I think it's worked pretty well. Now, most mayors would say, no, you really squeezed us, and we've never been able to catch up. I will tell you that it's not a perfect formula, because while it controlled two parts of the three parts that go into elements that go into property taxation, it did not control assessment. And State Representative Tom Saunders, who's on his way into retirement this year, was the only Republican member of the House to vote against it. As a former assessor, he knew, in his mind at least, that the whole thing was a farce. All you had to do was raise assessments, and you got to raise property taxes as much as you wanted. He suffered significantly in his political career because of that. He was ostracized by the then Republican governor's office and had a limited impact from then on in the Republican caucus. But he was a courageous Republican that day by recognizing the fallacies or the imperfections, so to speak, of that process. The fact is, if the economy's bad and the market's bad, the assessments will stay even or go down, and then people complain about that too. I've had my house; it was an investment. My assessment hasn't gone up in years. I can't sell my house for more money than I bought it. So, it's kind of like property owners are a lot like farmers. The weather's never good enough for a farmer, and for the property owners, the assessments are never right. It's either too high or too low.
Laura, is this basically just good old-fashioned supply and demand? I mean, it's been a tight housing market for a few years. Assessments always land like a couple of years behind, and so assessments just basically catching up, with free market principles of supply and demand. A lot of demand for housing, not enough supply.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I just love listening to Mike talk sometimes, and I just kept nodding my head the whole time he was talking because I loved the history lesson and the sort of perspective he brings. But yes, Abdul, I mean, housing prices have gone up. It's unprecedented. I mean, if you own a home, you're always amazed at, what the houses are selling for around you. That makes it obviously complicated for people who are new home buyers trying to get in the market right now. But housing prices have gone up, so assessments have gone up. So again, there are economic factors at play here that can't be solved in a really simple way.
Brad, let me get your thoughts, because obviously, like I said, property taxes are a big deal, not only for residential, but also for businesses as well. Is this just simply, just good old-fashioned supply and demand? There's a demand for housing, and there's a demand for housing has been here for a while, and so as the demand goes up, so do the assessments because your home is worth more.
Well, that's true. So, I mean, at this point, it's all just somewhat basic math. So, yes, if everybody's home value has gone up 50% in the last year and a half, 2 years, that means your total assessment has gone up 50% in the last year and a half or 2 years. Now, the other side of that coin is they will only tax you the amount that your local government is spending. So just because those caps go up doesn't mean that they have to spend another 50%. So I think that it's going to be incumbent on all of us in the legislature to kind of lean on local government and say, just because you have the ability to spend more now doesn't mean that you should.
You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. We come to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. Our guests on the program today are Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Laura Beck, and our good friend Brad Klopfenstein from the Florida Chamber of Commerce. I want to change gears a little bit, folks, talk about sort of a tragedy that's been happening at the national level, sort of these mass shootings. We've seen them in Texas. We've seen them in New York. We've also seen them in Oklahoma. We've got the federal level. You've got folks actually having conversations about what to do about sort of these types of issues. Mike, let me start with you. Realistically, what can be done to curb mass shootings, or can they be curbed?
Well, I mean, we'd like to curb them, obviously. I mean, one mass shooting is too much, as they say. First of all, you have to define mass shootings, and people get pretty loose with that term. Some groups define a mass shooting as, anytime 3 people are killed or more. Some say 4, some say 8. So you have to be careful about how you define mass shooting. But let's just give it the most liberal definition, say 3 people or more. There's a lot can be done. Number one, there's mental health. If you look at the last 2, I guess, most recent mass shooters, the one in Texas and one in Buffalo, New York, they both had telegraphed and been interviewed, so to speak, by law enforcement, by mental health officials about their mental health capacity, so to speak. And they still were able to get a gun. They were not red flagged. Number 2, universal background checks. In the 1990s, the NRA testified in Congress in favor of universal background checks. And then for whatever reason, they backtracked, reversed position, whatever. the fact is that those are not unreasonable. They don't violate Second Amendment rights at all, just to have a background check. Number three, both in the case of Buffalo and again in Texas, those kids, so to speak, had juvenile records of being investigated, and because they were juveniles, their records were sealed and not available to gun shop owners to be able to check. And so I think it's important that we when it comes to that kind of investigation, those kinds of juvenile records, that they be opened up so that we can look into a juvenile's record. If he's 14 years old, he said crazy things or tried crazy things. We need to know that before we let that person have a gun. So, and then there's just the mental health treatment in general. Evan Bayh, in his term, closed down most of the state mental institutions. And I know, for examples of people in Kokomo, Howard County, who've been waiting 4 years to get a spot at the Logansport mental hospital. And so we shot ourselves in the foot, no pun intended. We diminished our ability to handle mental health here in Indiana. We tried to send everybody out into the community. And when you send people with mental health problems out into the community, they cause problems in the community. So we have to do a lot more about mental health.
Laura, we talk about mental health. We talk about expanding background checks. What about sort of like, maybe sort of these bans? That's obviously going to be a very contentious issue at both the federal and the state level. And do you ever see us at a point where we start banning certain types of weapons?
Well, I mean, I want to just say one thing about Mike's point on Evan Bayh. I mean, these recent shootings were not done because Evan Bayh closed state mental health institutions. I mean, these were 18-year-old people who, obviously weren't in Indiana. So I think that's a key point. I also think with some of these young men who are out committing these crimes, they are unfortunately a part of this internet ecosystem. And so I think big tech has a huge role to play in this as well. I do think mental health is an important piece. Yes, I mean, I do think that some type of assault weapon ban or assault weapon limitation is really incredibly important. And President Biden put it really well when he said, yes, you've got these 18-year-old young men who are using these assault weapons, and you have 18-year-olds who are using them in the military, but they are trained by some of the best people in the world doing this. There's no reason why you need to have an assault weapon, frankly. I don't understand it. You don't need to hunt a deer with an assault weapon. You don't need to hunt a grouse or a squirrel with an assault weapon. So it's something that I think is hopefully on the horizon. I am not hopeful at all about Indiana because we're moving to being able to carry a gun without a permit within a matter of days. But from a really personal standpoint on this, my son was in preschool when Sandy Hook happened. And the day he graduated from the 8th grade was when the Uvalde massacre occurred. So for his entire elementary school career, he has lived and has experienced lockdown drills, living with the threat of this for an entire elementary school career. It's something that we didn't experience. It's something Mike didn't experience. Brad, you didn't either, and Abdul, you didn't. So I think we have to get this ship righted. We've got to get it right. But arguing over the fact that we're going to take all your guns away is not an effective way to do it. There's very common sense proposals that have been put forward. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do this and to get it right.
Brad, let me get your thoughts before we take our first break.
Sure. Well, I would like to say it was not uncommon for me to have a weapon in the back of my vehicle when I went to high school every single day of my high school year, because me and my friends would go out and do target practice after school. Mm-hmm. Never once did any of those weapons get fired at school or on school grounds. And even though we were juveniles, we were responsible. What we have here is a mental health crisis, and this is kind of how it's showing itself. I do want to know when Mike Murphy is going to run for office again, because I will be lining up to be on the Mike Murphy for whatever bandwagon.
Never.
But I agree. Somehow we need to have their juvenile records shouldn't be sealed the moment you turn 18. There needs to be some sort of a period where if you're between 18 and 21, your juvenile record is still available, but yet you are accumulating your adult record. So that way we can go back and check. But in every single instance, you have a disturbed individual who does horrible things to other people. And there's almost always a red flag on this. And we need to be able to assess these red flags, even if they were a juvenile when it happened. Because as we see, most of these people are 18, 19, 20. There needs to be that range where their juvenile records can still be accessed and used in order for them to get a gun. And I think that more money going into mental health and mental health assessment probably is going to be what ends up solving this in the long run.
You're watching Indiana Issues. Our guests on the program today are Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Laura Beck, and our friend Brad Klopfenstein from the Greater Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. We're going to take ourselves a quick break. We come back. State conventions are right around the corner. And also, how healthy is Indiana's economy? All that's still ahead on Indiana Issues. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndianaPolitics.org, coming to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. Well, in just a couple of weeks, Indiana Republicans and Democrats will have their state conventions where they will nominate candidates for Secretary of State, for State Treasurer, and State Auditor. Now, there are no contested races on the Democratic side, at least for right now. And on the Republican side, there's no contested race for State Auditor. However, there are contested races when it comes to Secretary of State as well as to the State Treasurer. Let's go ahead, Jacob, if we could, and put up our list real quickly here. For Secretary of State, the contestants are Holly Sullivan, who's the incumbent, followed by former Mike Pence State Diego Morales, and Dave Shelton, who is the Knox County Clerk. Now, the contenders for State Treasurer, the list is a little bit longer. We have Dan Elliott, Morgan County Republican Chairman, Lana Kiesling, who's up in Boone County. She's up in Allen County. Elise Nishala, who's in Boone County, and Pete Seat, former White House press aide. Mike, let's go ahead and start with you. A lot of attention has been put on the Secretary of State's race, particularly between Diego Morales and Holly Sullivan. Holly Sullivan obviously having the backing of the governor, Diego Morales having sort of the people who are mad at the governor's backing. What do you see happening there, or can we make a prediction right now?
I think it's too early. I think they're very different people. Holly is a trained engineer, a businesswoman, been vice chairman of the Republican Party. She certainly may rise or fall on the perception of Governor Holcomb. I mean, she has been part of, the Governor Holcomb political machine and promoting him and helping him be successful for the past several years. Diego, on the other side, is I would call him the Energizer Bunny of the Republican Party. He's been to so many chicken dinners, God knows how many. And he's just a nice guy who has served in minor roles in for example, in the Pence administration, as an advance man and things like that. He's a veteran. He's a immigrant, by the way, a legal immigrant. And so they both have their own elements. One thing, if I've ever had a criticism of how the Republican Party handles convention races, is that people often will choose an office holder based on how many Lincoln dinners he or she attended, as if somehow that qualifies you to be in office. I mean, it helps you build relationships, but it doesn't make you qualified to serve in a statewide office. One thing about delegates of both parties is, and I think I can be pretty broad here, is that delegates to the convention like to be paid attention to. They like to meet the candidate in person they like to feel like they have a personal relationship, so to speak, even if it's just meeting at a dinner with the person they decide to vote for. And I can tell you, if it came down to that, Diego would win because he has been everywhere. And Holly's attendance rate, so to speak, at the Lincoln Day dinners has been far less than Diego. So it depends what your criteria are. It's still too early to tell.
Laura, let me get your thoughts on this, because obviously Republicans have a contested race. Democrats have a named candidate for Secretary of State, but none for Auditor and for State Treasurer. Is it just a foregone conclusion that Republicans will sweep things this midterm election?
Well, I don't think anything ever is a foregone conclusion, Abdul, and I don't think I just don't think that's the case at all. What I think has been so interesting about this Republican convention is that it will be obviously certainly filled with drama. They tend to be the Republican state conventions, but it speaks to it potentially speaks to the waning influence of Governor Holcomb based on who comes out of this election, and that's not uncommon for a late-term governor, particularly when there are a number of people lining up in the wings to take over from them. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it all shakes out. I mean, you also have, with the limited internet research I've done on the various candidates, Diego Morales does have a very interesting background, especially with his support of former President Trump, and that may very well be what puts him over the top in a very base election. But then you also have, when you think about Secretary of State, you also have this is a really incredibly important job. And frankly, there was one of the candidates, I think it was Dave Shelton, when I was reading about his platform, actually suggested having clerk boot camp. And that is really very helpful for the clerks. And so I think what ends up happening at the convention is they get all caught up in the politics, but not necessarily in the policy. And I think on the Democrat side, you're going to hear a lot of really solid, good policies going forward.
All right, Brad, let me get your thoughts on what do you think may happen at the Republican and Democratic state conventions?
Well, first, let me say Larry's right. There needs to be a boot camp for any county clerk because it is a highly important job. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome the Republicans and Democrats to the convention party, since the Libertarians did theirs 3 months ago and nominated 3 statewide candidates. I don't know where the other 2 have been. With Republicans for Secretary of State, I assume that we're just discounting Paul Hager. I'm pretty sure that he's a candidate, and I know that only because he was running ads on WIBC, which is a bit curious since he went to expensive airwaves to reach 1,000 potential voters. So it'll be curious. I'll be very curious to see who the Republicans choose. You're right. They're probably 2 marquee candidates, probably are not their best candidate. And I'll leave it at that. But ultimately, I think that this is going to be a very good thing for Jeff Maurer, the Libertarian nominee. He's been out hitting it. He's been on doing a lot of interviews, TV and radio. He's building some name ID. And I think that he is far and away the most qualified to be Secretary of State. So I think that once he can stand shoulder to shoulder with whoever the nominees are, I think that he's going to show well.
You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazi, editor and publisher of IndianaPolitics.org. Our guests on the program today are Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Laura Beck, and our good friend Brad Klopfenstein, the Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. Guys, our final topic, I want to talk about Indiana's economy. Major billions of dollars worth of announcements in Whitestown and Kokomo, also up in Boone County. Mike, how would you say Indiana's economy is doing, and what are some of the pitfalls we need to worry about?
I think Indiana's economy is doing incredibly well. I mean, we're now in our 3rd Republican governor, which means three governors full of prosperity, frankly. We're at whatever is a 2.2% unemployment or something like that, is somewhere over $6 billion surplus. And, cash is king. Cash gives you options. So I think from that standpoint, we're great. Now, is our workforce is trained up as it should be? Absolutely not. And the governor would say that's true as well. I was curious to see David Ricks blast away at the governor in his recent economic club speech a few weeks ago. I can tell you the CEO of Lilly doesn't do anything halfway or ad hoc. I'm sure that speech was planned and written and vetted by every communications person at Eli Lilly. And then the very next week or week and a half later, he comes out and announces a major investment in Indianapolis, or I should say Boone County, which seems to be a little bit incongruous to what he just blasted the governor for a couple of weeks earlier. There's some rumor out there that David Ricks may be planning a gubernatorial run in 2024, in which case he would clearly jump to the front of the pack of viability. So, but the overall point is look at Indiana versus Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan. I would rather be living in the state of Indiana, even without a surplus, than in any of those states. I think we're in pretty good shape.
Laura, what about our workforce? Because Mike brings up an interesting point. We have the jobs here, but do we have the workforce to fill those jobs?
I don't necessarily think we do. I think that we have a lot of work to do. And I think that we've got a lot of talented people in place to help make that happen. But one of the things that David Ricks said, which got the attention of a lot of people, is that our education system, our workforce, our healthcare, the state of Hoosiers is not as strong as it could be to meet the jobs of the future. So while we may be doing well today, we may not be able to compete in the future because we don't have those pieces in play. And when you consider in his remarks to the Economic Club, which were clearly talked about and all over the state and probably all over in a lot of other places as well, 37% of Hoosier kids who are graduating from high school aren't proficient in the state math testing. And I'm certainly not someone who is in favor of over testing our kids. But at the same time, if we're going to try and be a high-tech capital, we've got to have a stronger place we've got to have a stronger training system and a stronger network in place. You add to that the fact that we have a surplus and that's fantastic, but we don't have any type of pre-K or childcare. So parents can actually have a flexible work schedule. Parents can actually go to work. We don't have an infrastructure in place. And I think that's really going to impact us, especially as we move forward and especially as we're trying to fill these jobs. You add to it, we're trying to attract people to Indiana, but it's hard to attract people to high-paying jobs in Indiana and to come here when you've got a legislature who is preoccupied with kids who identify as a different gender playing on a soccer team. So you add that to it, and we may not be the friendliest climate, especially as you're looking forward.
Brad, as someone who deals with business on a daily basis, how would you assess Indiana's economy, and what do we need to do to make sure the workforce is ready for those jobs that are coming here?
Indiana's economy is doing fantastic, and every time you get one of these announcements, I think that's good for incumbents. But are we ready to fill these jobs, and do we have the manpower to do it? Absolutely not. So we're somehow going to have to figure out. Indiana still has a net loss of college graduates. We graduate a ton of kids from college, and then they go everywhere but Indiana. So somehow we have to be able to keep them in Indiana, make Indiana a place that they want to be, and make sure that our talent that we've educated is staying right here in Indiana.
All right. Well, now it's time for our final segment of the program, Predictions and Prognostications, where we ask our panel to look into their crystal balls and make a prediction or see what Hoosiers should be paying attention to. So, Mike, quickly, we'll start with you.
Well, I think we're doing pretty well here at home, but we cannot ignore, certainly, we should focus on, I think, if we're going to worry about anything, our worries and our prayers should be with the international situation. We have the potential for a worldwide famine with the Russian blockading of the port of Odessa and other Ukrainian ports. That has to be solved, hopefully peacefully. There's so much saber rattling going on, mostly on the part of the Russians, that I worry about our future, my children's future, and my grandchildren's future from the international situation far more than I do from domestic jobs and workforce development. That's going to take care of itself because the supply will meet the demand at some point. I think we really have a lot to worry about across the pond.
Laura?
I agree with Mike, especially on the international piece. I think that we are seeing the effects of a global economy. I think we are seeing the impacts of global interdependence. And again, I think we're also seeing the impacts, as he said, of the Russians and their just unmitigated aggression. And the other piece I also think we're seeing too is misinformation. It is so easy to fall prey to misinformation, and we certainly know that the Russians are quite good at that. Another piece I think that we should be paying a lot of close attention to are two things. One, and they kind of go together. One is the domestic terrorism piece. I think we have to really get good, and we've got to get smart at identifying and educating younger people, particularly younger men who are at risk of falling prey to the gun culture, to the culture of violence, and as well as to this tech ecosystem that they fall into in this very unmonitored and unmitigated, or not unmitigated, but very unmonitored environment. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be paying close attention to that. The other piece I'm watching, frankly, is the fact that we will be going to a permitless carry state. You can just walk around with your gun without a permit as we move into the future. And I think that's incredibly concerning here in Indiana.
Brad Klopfenstein, I'll give you the last word, my friend.
Sure. It's June 2022 right now. We're going to have to write this down because my prediction starts January 1st of 2023 and beyond. I think the Republicans figured out, certainly with the Secretary of State and even the governor's office in 2016, how to perpetually have an incumbent on the ballot. I think that we're going to see Governor Holcomb quite possibly take another job before the end of his term. And especially if we see that Suzanne Crouch resigns for a better job and they slot somebody else in who you might think is going to be a contender for the governor's office in 2024, I bet he resigns, and I bet they run an incumbent in 2024.
All right. Well, our guests on the program today have been Republican Mike Murphy, Democrat Laura Beck, and Brad Klopfenstein from the Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Thank you all for joining us. Excuse me. And also thank our good friends here at Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. We appreciate you being with us. We'll talk to you next time on Indiana Issues.